A disabled veteran couldn't fix his ramp. Hell's Angels spent the weekend building one. "Please don't make me crawl up my own porch," Harlan Miller said, his voice scraping thin as gravel. "I was told the chair was approved, and now I can't even reach my front door." At 6:17 p.m., the 68-year-old former military medic sat crooked in his manual wheelchair with both palms raw from gripping the push rims. One wheel sunk half an inch into wet clay beside the collapsed ramp, and a grease-stained delivery notice folded against his knee with the code 402B circled in red ink. The medical equipment truck was still idling below the hill, but the driver had already been told not to unload the new power chair until the access ramp was declared safe, and every minute that engine rumbled felt like another door shutting in Harlan's face. Then the sound changed, deep and rolling, as a Harley climbed the rocky lane, and Kellen Forge Broderick stepped into view, his Hell's Angels leather vest creaking over his massive shoulders, while his shadow fell across the broken boards like a steel wall beside a fragile old man. Harlan looked up and did not know whether to feel relieved or embarrassed. Kellen was 52, white, broad as a workbench, with a gray beard, a scar tucked along his jaw, and a black leather vest dusted with metal grit, as if he had just walked out of a welding shop. He did not smile. He did not ask the kind of soft questions that make a proud man feel smaller. He just stood there, studying the splintered pine ramp, the rusted brackets, the washed-out slope, and the way Harlan had positioned his chair so close to the porch that one wrong push would trap him against the jagged edge of the broken planks. The cabin sat high on a rocky hillside where the road turned from gravel to mud, and the place smelled of wet earth, old iron, and rain trapped in rotting wood. The ramp had once been Harlan's only clean path from the front door to the world below, 18 feet of pine boards laid over a steep grade, but now it folded in the middle like a snapped ruler. The lower support beam had pulled away from 3 rusted 3/8-inch lag screws, and the boards around the break were dark, soft, and flaking under their own weight. It had failed quietly at first. Then all at once, Harlan had tried to fix it before anyone came. A small welder sat useless near the porch, its cord coiled beside a metal toolbox with one latch missing, and a strip of angle iron lay across his knees where he had balanced it for almost an hour before admitting he could not hold it, align it, and fasten it from a wheelchair on a washed-out slope. He had spent a lifetime being the man who reached others when they could not reach safety, and now he could not cross the space between his porch and his driveway. That was the part he hated most. Not the chair. Not the pain in his wrists. The waiting. The new power wheelchair was parked inside the delivery truck below, wrapped in clear plastic, its black tires still clean, its control arm folded neatly like a promise no one intended to keep. The driver had stayed polite, but the answer had been final. No compliant ramp, no delivery. Kellen bent down, picked up a broken piece of pine, and pressed his thumb into the grain. The wood crumbled. He glanced at the slope, then at the porch height, then at the thin trail Harlan's wheels had carved through the mud. Behind him, 2 more adult riders rolled in and shut off their engines, leaving a heavy silence over the hill. Kellen pulled a 25-foot tape from his vest pocket and hooked it to the porch frame. The metal blade hissed across the broken ramp. Harlan swallowed hard, thinking the biker would shake his head and tell him the job was too far gone. Instead, Kellen marked the first point on the rock with white chalk, then another, 6 marks in a line where the hill itself could hold weight if someone knew how to ask it properly. He looked back at Harlan, his face rough, unreadable, and strangely gentle around the eyes. "This ramp didn't need patching," he said. "It needed someone stubborn enough to build it like it mattered." Victor Hayes came up the hill with the clean impatience of a man who had never had to fight a driveway in a wheelchair. His polished brown shoes picked carefully around the mud while one hand held a black clipboard tight against his chest, and the other kept his jacket away from the wet brush. He was white, middle-aged, neat in a way that made the hillside look even rougher around him, and his expression did not change when he saw Harlan's hands shaking on the push rims or the broken ramp hanging between the porch and the ground. He looked at the wood first. Then he looked at the paper. Not the man. "Mr. Miller," Victor said, "this property does not meet access delivery requirements." Harlan's jaw tightened, and for a second the only sound was the soft tick of the medical truck cooling below them and the faint drip of rainwater from the cabin roof. Kellen remained near the chalk marks, silent, His big frame turned slightly toward Victor, his Hell's Angels vest still creaking when he breathed. Victor unclipped the top sheet and held it where Harlan could see the red stamp already pressed across the page. Delivery suspended. Beneath it, in block print, was the line that had crushed the whole day down to one code. Code 402B, unsafe access ramp, non-compliant entry grade. The notice was grease-stained from Harlan's fingers now, bent at the corners, with a smudge of mud across the lower margin where it had slipped from his lap earlier. It looked small enough to fold. It was heavy enough to trap him. Harlan cleared his throat and tried to keep his voice level. The chair was approved 3 weeks ago. I got the call Monday. They said all I had to do was be home. Victor did not blink. Approval of the device and approval of delivery conditions are separate matters. The sentence landed colder than the wind moving over the stones. Harlan pushed his chair half an inch forward before the front caster bumped against a split board and stopped him. I can't get down there to sign for it if you won't bring it up, and I can't fix the ramp without the chair that lets me move safely. Victor glanced at the collapsed pine as if the ramp had personally inconvenienced him. The combined equipment and occupant weight exceeds the safe rating of the existing structure. The minimum required load is 600 pounds. Your current ramp is compromised. He tapped the clipboard twice. I am not authorized to release the unit. That was the whole machine speaking through one man. Kellen finally lifted his eyes from the paper, but he still did not step toward Victor. He only reached down, took the denial notice gently from Harlan's hand, and read it from top to bottom, including the smaller print near the bottom edge where a delivery technician had written wooden ramp collapse risk in blue pen. His scarred thumb paused over the code 402B. Then he handed it back without a word. Harlan looked embarrassed, angry, and tired all at once. He had worn the same faded gray work shirt for 2 days because laundry was downstairs in the shed, and the shed might as well have been across a river now. His boots, planted on the footrests, were scuffed white at the toes from years of dragging against thresholds. He was not asking for luxury. He was asking for a way to enter his own home. Victor folded the corner of the top sheet back into place. Once the access issue is resolved, you may request a second delivery attempt. How long? Harlan asked. Victor checked another page. Scheduling windows vary. Could be 10 business days. Could be longer. The words made Harlan's shoulders drop, just slightly, but Kellen saw it. 10 business days meant 10 more days of fighting the porch, the mud, the old manual chair, and the broken strip of pine that had turned a cabin into a cage. The delivery driver, a grown man in a Navy uniform, stood beside the truck below with his hands in his pockets, looking up like he wished the hill would give him permission to do the right thing. It did not. Victor did not look back at him. Kellen took one slow step closer, stopping far enough away that there was no threat in it, only presence. Let me ask you something, he said, voice low and rough from years of smoke, engines, and shop dust. If there's a ramp here that meets your load requirement, stable, anchored, safe under that chair and Mr. Miller, you deliver it. Victor's mouth tightened because the question left him nowhere to hide except inside his own rule. If the access path is compliant and safe, the delivery can proceed. Kellen nodded once, as if Victor had just signed a contract he did not understand. Harlan looked up at him, confused, still braced for disappointment. The biker's eyes moved from the red code to the broken wood to the rock beneath the mud. Then the problem isn't the chair, Kellen said. The problem is the hill hasn't met us yet. Kellen did not argue with Victor after that. He did not raise his voice, did not crowd him, did not make a show for the delivery driver watching from the bottom of the lane. He simply turned away from the clipboard and began treating the hillside like a problem made of steel, weight, slope, and time. From the inside pocket of his vest, he pulled a short carpenter's pencil, blackened at one end, and wrote 3 numbers across the back of a scrap envelope Harlan kept tucked beneath his chair cushion. 18 feet, 48 inches, 600 pounds. Then he crossed out the last number and wrote 800 beneath it. Harlan stared at the mark, unsure whether it was a promise or a dare. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. Kellen looked at the broken ramp, not at him. I know. That made it worse for Harlan. Somehow, because pity always came with noise, but this man's kindness came with measurements. The other adult riders had spread out without being told. One knelt near the lower brake and checked the mud line against the buried rocks. Another pulled a small level from a saddlebag and set it on the porch threshold. A third, a white-haired rider with oil-dark hands and a calm face, took photos of the collapsed pine, the pulled lag screws, the red stamp notice, and the uneven grade leading down to the truck. No one joked. No one posed. The hill had become a job site before a single tool was unloaded. Victor watched them with the tight irritation of someone losing control without being confronted. Any modification to the property would require owner consent, he said. Harlan gave a dry laugh, almost bitter. It's my cabin. Victor adjusted his grip on the clipboard. And any installed access structure must be stable, safe, and capable of bearing the equipment. Kellen nodded once. You said that. He crouched beside one of the chalk marks and brushed wet grit off the stone with his bare hand. Under the mud was not loose soil but hard gray rock, the kind that did not care about paperwork, weather, or excuses. Kellen tapped it with the end of his tape measure and listened to the sound. Solid. He looked back at Harlan. This hill's got a spine. For the first time that evening, Harlan almost smiled, but the expression faded when he saw the medical chair still waiting below. The plastic wrap around it flashed in the last dull light, clean and unreachable, while the truck's rear lift sat closed like a sealed gate. The driver called up that he had 20 more minutes before dispatch required him to leave. 20 minutes. That was all the system had left for a man who had waited weeks. Harlan's hands closed again around the push rims, and the raw skin at the base of his thumbs pulled tight. He hated that Kellen could see it. He hated that Victor could see it more. Kellen stood slowly, and his leather vest creaked across his shoulders, the Hell's Angels patched dark against the fading sky. The sound of more motorcycles drifted up from the lower road, not fast, not reckless, just steady, one after another, until the hillside began to tremble with low thunder. Victor turned his head. The delivery driver did too. Around the bend came more adult riders, all grown men, all white, their faces rough from sun, work, and years on the road, their bikes muddy at the tires and heavy with tool rolls, welding leads, clamps, and canvas bags tied down with black straps. They parked in a loose line along the edge of the road, engines shutting off one by one until only the ticking metal remained. The silence after them was bigger than the noise. Harlan looked at Kellen, suddenly suspicious, suddenly afraid of being made into some kind of spectacle. I don't want trouble brought to my door, he said. Kellen's face softened, but only a little. Then we won't bring trouble. He pointed at the broken ramp. We'll bring steel. Victor gave a short, humorless breath. You cannot fabricate an approved structure before my delivery window expires. Kellen looked down the hill at the truck, then at the porch, then at the 6 chalk marks on the rock. Not tonight. He folded the tape measure closed with a sharp snap. But you already said what happens when it's safe. Victor said nothing, and that silence mattered. Kellen stepped closer to Harlan's chair and lowered his voice so only the old man could hear. You got somewhere dry to sleep tonight? Harlan's pride rose first, automatic and hard. Then the truth followed behind it. I can get from the kitchen to the bed. That's about it. Kellen nodded as if that answer had been enough. Tomorrow morning, this stops being your problem alone. Below them, the delivery driver shut the truck's rear doors with a reluctant metallic clank. Victor slid the denial notice back into his clipboard, but he did not look satisfied anymore. Harlan watched the taillights begin to turn at the bottom of the hill, taking the new chair away from him, and for a moment the cabin felt smaller than ever. Then Kellen picked up the broken piece of pine, set it gently beside the porch instead of tossing it aside, and marked one final, white line across the rock. This is where the first anchor goes, he said. The old ramp was dead. The new one had just been named. By the time the medical truck disappeared down the lower road, the hillside had gone quiet in a way that felt unfinished. Victor remained near the porch with his clipboard held too tightly, as if the red stamped notice could still command the mud, the rock, and the men standing around him. Harlan watched the taillights shrink between the pines, and the ache in his hands seemed to move higher, past his wrists, into his chest. He had not begged for comfort. He had begged for access. Victor cleared his throat and tried to recover the hard edge of his authority. Mr. Miller, I strongly advise against allowing unlicensed alterations that may create additional liability. Harlan turned his chair a few inches, enough to face him. You just told me the current ramp already failed. That is correct. Then what exactly am I risking? Victor had no quick answer for that. and the silence pressed against him harder than any shouted accusation could have. Kellen stood near the first chalk mark, one boot planted on stone, the other in mud, looking at the hill as if he could already see the shape of the structure hidden inside it. He had heard men like Victor before, men who used policy like a locked gate and called it protection from the safe side. He did not hate the rules. Rules could keep a chair from tipping, a porch from collapsing, a man from trusting rotten wood. What he hated was the moment a rule stopped serving a person and started replacing him. Victor flipped through the papers again. Any future delivery will require documentation that the access path supports no less than 600 pounds of combined equipment and occupant load. Kellen nodded toward the broken ramp. What about 800? Victor looked up. 800 would exceed the minimum. Good. One word. Flat as steel. Harlan stared at him, half grateful and half afraid to hope. The air smelled of wet pine, rusted screw heads, and the cooling engines lined along the road. One of the riders, a thick-armed white man in his late 50s with silver stubble and a faded welding cap tucked into his belt, knelt by the torn support beam and measured the gap from the porch threshold to the first stone shelf. 31 inches of rise, he called. Another rider checked the distance to the lower landing and answered, 19 feet to give it a clean run if we angle it left. Kellen's eyes narrowed. 22 if we add a switchback pad. Victor looked from one man to the next, realizing too late that they were not guessing. These were not spectators. These were workers who carried skill under leather. Kellen asked Harlan for permission before anyone touched the cabin frame, and that mattered more to the old man than he wanted to show. Harlan gave a stiff nod. If you can do it without tearing the place apart. Kellen glanced at the rotted pine, the split posts, the rusted brackets hanging loose from the porch beam. We won't tear it apart. He touched the stone with the toe of his boot. We'll stop asking Badwood to do a rock's job. The riders began speaking in low practical terms. Diamond plate decking, 2x4 steel tube, cross braces at 16-inch intervals, handrail height at 36 inches, 5/8-inch wedge anchors drilled deep enough to bite into stone instead of mud. Harlan listened to the words and felt something unfamiliar pass through him. Not rescue exactly. Respect. They were not talking around him like a fragile object. They were planning with him still in the room. Victor snapped the clipboard shut. I will note that the delivery was declined due to non-compliant access as of today. Kellen looked at him then, finally giving the full weight of his attention. His face was rough, his beard gray at the chin, his leather vest creaking as he shifted, but his voice stayed calm. You do that. Victor's lips thinned. And if I return Monday, the same standards apply. They better, Kellen said. That paper's the only honest thing you brought. The words were not loud, but they landed. Harlan lowered his gaze to the denial notice in his lap, to the red code 402B that had felt like a sentence only an hour earlier. Now it looked different. It looked like a target. Victor stepped carefully back down the muddy path, avoiding the collapsed ramp as though it might stain his polished shoes with blame. No one blocked him. No one followed him. The riders simply watched him leave, their quiet making the hillside feel larger than his authority. When his car finally pulled away, Kellen turned to the men and gave 3 short instructions. Bring the generator, bring the plate, bring enough steel to shame that paper. Then he looked at Harlan, who sat in the fading light beside the dead ramp, still trapped, but no longer alone. Tomorrow morning, Kellen said. We build it so even he has to trust it. Saturday morning arrived without speeches, without banners, without anyone pretending the job would be easy. At 7:08 a.m., the first generator coughed to life at the bottom of the hill, then settled into a hard, steady growl that rolled through the wet stones and shook dew from the low brush. Harlan sat just inside his open doorway with a mug of black coffee cooling between both hands, watching Kellen and the other adult riders turn his washed-out hillside into something that looked less like a rescue and more like an industrial repair yard. A flatbed truck had backed as far up the muddy lane as it could go, loaded with sheets of 1/4-inch diamond plate steel, lengths of 2x4-inch rectangular steel tubing, orange extension cords, welding leads, clamps, cutting discs, and heavy boxes marked 5/8-inch wedge anchors. The air still smelled of wet earth and old rot, but now there was another smell cutting through it, sharp and electric, the metallic bite of work about to begin. Kellen stood over the chalk marks from the night before, his Hell's Angels leather vest dark against a gray thermal shirt, his beard tucked close to his chest as he read the slope with his eyes. He had a welder's hood hanging from one hand and a tape measure clipped to his belt, and when he spoke, every man moved like they had been waiting for the shape of the day to become clear. Lower landing first, then the spine. No plate goes down until the anchors hold. That was all. The old ramp came off in sections, not with rage but with care, because Harlan had crossed those boards for years and Kellen seemed to understand that even failed things could deserve respect. Two riders lifted the broken pine away from the porch and stacked it beside the cabin, exposing the rusted brackets and the empty screw holes where the old 3/8-inch lag screws had pulled loose. One board snapped under its own weight as it was carried, soft in the center from hidden rot. Harlan looked away. Kellen saw it, but he did not say anything. He simply set a gloved hand on the porch frame, checked the threshold height again, and marked a fresh line where the steel would meet the cabin without asking rotten wood to carry the load. Soon the hill filled with sound. A hammer drill bit into the rock with a grinding scream, spitting pale dust into the mud. Steel tubing rang when it was dragged into place, the hollow clank traveling down the slope like a bell struck under the ground. The generator thumped, the grinder whined, and then the first arc lit under Kellen's hood, blue-white and fierce, throwing sparks across the morning like tiny falling stars. Ozone bloomed in the air, hot and clean, mixing with rust, wet pine, coffee, and the faint oil smell from the parked Harleys lined along the lane. No one wasted motion. One rider held the frame square with a magnetic angle clamp. Another brushed slag from the seam. Another checked the rise with a 4-foot level and called out corrections in half-inch increments. Harlan listened from the doorway as if the hill had learned a new language, one made of numbers, heat, and patience. He had expected men in leather to bring noise. Instead, they brought precision. By noon, the first steel spine stretched from the lower landing toward the porch, not finished, not pretty yet, but real enough to cast a straight shadow over the mud that had trapped him. Kellen wiped soot from his cheek with the back of his glove and looked up at Harlan. "We're not patching your way out," he said. "We're building your way back." Harlan tried to answer, but his throat tightened before the words came. Below him, a rider tightened the first wedge anchor until the socket wrench gave a clean metallic click. The rock held. By late Saturday, the hillside no longer looked like a place where one old ramp had failed. It looked like a place where men had decided failure was not allowed to have the last word. The steel spine now ran clean from the lower landing to the first switchback pad, braced with diagonal tubing every 16 inches, each joint tack welded first, checked, then burned in solid under Kellen's steady hand. Harlan watched the work from the doorway with a blanket over his legs and the red stamp denial notice folded on the table beside him, but his eyes kept drifting to the way the frame refused to shake when the riders stepped across it. It was strange to see strength being built so quietly. Around 4:36 p.m., a light wind moved over the hill, carrying the smell of ozone, hot steel, wet leaves, and coffee that had gone bitter in the pot. Kellen lifted his welding hood and rolled his shoulders once, the leather of his Hell's Angels vest creaking over the old scar along his jaw. He had been working since morning with almost no talk, stopping only to check measurements, grind a bead smooth, or run his thumb along a seam to feel whether the metal had taken properly. Then Harlan noticed something small and unexpected. When Kellen reached into his vest for a rag, a faded cloth patch slipped halfway out of the inside pocket, pale blue and white, frayed at the edges, marked with a simple medical cross stitched by hand. It was not polished, not framed, not displayed for sympathy. It looked worn from years of being carried close. Harlan saw it before Kellen tucked it away, and for a moment the two men simply looked at each other through the generator noise and the cooling click of steel. "You know medics?" Harlan asked. Kellen's face changed only slightly, but the silence around him got heavier. He set the rag down on the steel tube and took his time answering. Knew one who didn't ask questions before helping. Harlan waited, sensing there was more, but not pushing. Kellen crouched near the frame and brushed slag dust from a fresh weld with a wire brush, slow, even strokes, as if the motion helped him choose what could be said. "Years back, one of my brothers went off a mountain road in bad weather. Not a good night. Not a good place." He stopped there, careful with the memory, keeping it clean of details that did not belong on this hill. The man who found him was retired medical. Could have kept driving. Could have judged the patch on his back. Didn't. He stayed until help came. Harlan lowered his eyes. His own hands rested open on the arms of his wheelchair, the skin still raw at the base of his thumbs. And for the first time that weekend, he was not thinking about the ramp. He was thinking about the kind of life where strangers remember the hands that once kept someone breathing, even after the uniform is gone, even after the body weakens, even after the world starts treating access like a favor. Kellen picked up the faded patch and held it for only a second before folding it back into his vest. That man never sent a bill, he said. Never asked who deserved it. Short. Final. Harlan understood then why Kellen had not spoken to him like a charity case. This was not pity. This was a debt being paid forward in steel. Outside, one rider called for another length of tubing, and the work resumed as if the secret had been spoken only to strengthen the frame. The grinder threw orange sparks against the dimming hillside. The hammer drill bit into another anchor hole, 5/8 inch wide and 4 inches deep, biting past damp grit into the gray rock underneath. Kellen fitted the next brace by hand, tapped it into alignment with 2 clean strikes, and nodded for the clamp. The diagonal member locked the switchback pad into the main run, turning separate pieces into one rigid body. Harlan felt it in his chest. Not hope exactly. Something heavier. By sundown, the first diamond plate sheet was carried up by 4 riders and lowered onto the frame, its raised pattern catching the last light like scales on a metal river. Kellen checked the edge clearance at the threshold, then glanced back at Harlan. Power chair tires need bite in the rain, he said. Smooth steel would be pretty. Pretty gets people stuck. Harlan gave a rough breath that almost became a laugh. The old medic in him respected that answer more than any speech. Practical kindness. The kind that knew traction mattered. As darkness settled over the cabin, the generator lights came on, pale and humming, and the blue-white arc of Kellen's welder lit his face from beneath the hood. Sparks fell harmlessly into the mud. Steel met steel. The hill listened. Sunday morning came in colder, with the kind of gray light that made every weld bead and every wet stone show its truth. The hill had dried just enough to hold boot prints instead of swallowing them, but the slope was still slick where clay gathered between the rocks, and the old pine ramp lay stacked beside the cabin like a warning no one needed repeated. Kellen was already there before 6:50 a.m., standing beside the lower landing with a thermos in one hand and his welding hood in the other, studying the steel run as if it had spoken to him overnight. Harlan watched from the doorway, half expecting the riders to move slower after the long Saturday. But they worked with the same quiet force, shoulders stiff, hands dirty, eyes fixed on the next measurement. No one complained. The second generator started with a sharp pull and a cough, then joined the first in a low mechanical growl that settled under the hillside like a heartbeat. The riders began laying the remaining 1/4-inch diamond plate sheets along the upper run, each panel heavy enough that 4 grown men carried it with bent knees and careful steps. Kellen stopped them twice to shave the edge with a grinder so the plate would sit flush against the porch threshold without creating a lip that could catch a caster or tire. 1/8 of an inch becomes a mountain from a chair, he said, and Harlan felt that sentence in his bones. The work turned exacting as they reached the switchback pad. The rock did not give them a clean plane, and one anchor hole wandered when the hammer drill hit a buried seam. The bit screamed, slipped, and threw pale dust across Kellen's glove. He shut the drill off, stared at the mark, and shook his head once. Not there. He moved the anchor point 2 inches left, remeasured the diagonal brace, and had another rider cut a fresh piece of tubing to fit the new load path. It cost them 40 minutes. It saved the ramp. By midday, the structure had become something Harlan could understand even without walking it. Lower landing, angled run, square switchback, final rise to the porch, all tied into stone by 5/8 inch wedge anchors set 4 inches deep and torqued until the washers bit flat against steel. The handrails went up next, 36 inches high, double-sided, not decorative but steady, with rounded returns at the ends so clothing or bags would not snag. Kellen checked each rail by leaning his weight into it, not gently, not for show, just enough to make the steel answer. It answered by not moving. Harlan kept the denial notice on the table. Open now. The red code 402B facing the door, while the words unsafe access ramp sat under the morning light like an accusation losing strength. He found himself looking from the paper to the ramp and back again. One was a reason to stop. The other was a reason someone had refused to. Late in the afternoon, clouds thickened over the ridge, and the smell of rain moved in before the first drops appeared. The riders covered the welder, lifted cords out of puddles, and kept working under a stretch of canvas tied between two Harleys and the cabin post. Sparks flashed beneath it like blue-white fireflies, bright against the dim hillside, while ozone and hot metal cut through the smell of damp earth. Kellen's vest creaked whenever he bent over a seam. The Hell's Angels patched dark with mist, his scar lit and hidden again with every pulse of the arc. He was not gentle with the metal, but he was careful with the purpose. Every weld was brushed, checked, and touched again if the bead sat wrong. Every bolt was counted. Every edge was ground smooth. Harlan rolled closer to the threshold than he had dared all weekend, stopping where the old gap had once made his stomach tighten. Below him, the new ramp did not look temporary. It looked like it had grown out of the rock because a group of men had decided the hill should finally serve the person living on it. Near sunset, Kellen set the last upper plate into place and drove the final bolt through the frame with a clean metallic ring. The riders stepped back one by one, not celebrating yet, because the job was not finished until it carried weight, rain, doubt, and Monday morning. Kellen wiped his blackened hands on a rag, looked at the long steel path from driveway to porch, and gave the smallest nod. "Tonight we finish the seams," he said. "Tomorrow, that paper runs out of excuses." Monday morning broke clean and pale over the ridge, and for the first time all weekend the hillside looked less like a wound and more like a way forward. The rain had stopped during the night, leaving beads of water in the raised pattern of the diamond plate steel, but none of it pooled, none of it sagged, and none of it disappeared into rotten wood because there was no rotten wood left to trust. The new ramp ran from the lower drive to the porch in one heavy, deliberate path, 48 inches wide, double handrails at 36 inches, a square switchback pad bolted into the stone, and wedge anchors sunk deep enough that the hill itself seemed to be holding its breath around them. Harlan sat in the doorway with the denial notice on his lap, the red code 402B still visible, but it no longer felt like a verdict. It felt like evidence. Kellen stood at the top of the ramp with soot still under his fingernails and a line of dried mud across one boot, looking down the steel run as the last riders checked the final details. One man poured a little water across the upper plate and watched it break over the diamond tread instead of slicking smooth. Another pushed a loaded utility cart up the incline, its wheels carrying stacked steel scraps and a toolbox that brought the test weight close to 800 pounds. The frame gave no groan. The anchors did not shift. The rail did not flex. It held. At 8:23 a.m., the medical equipment truck appeared at the lower bend, followed by Victor Hayes's sedan crawling carefully through the wet gravel. The riders did not swarm. They did not shout. They simply lined their Harleys along both sides of the lower drive, engines off, adult men in leather standing beside their machines like witnesses called by the road itself. The silence was bigger than a threat because it asked for nothing except honesty. Victor stepped out in the same clean coat, though his shoes were not as polished now after the mud of Friday evening, and his clipboard was tucked under one arm like a shield that had grown thinner over the weekend. He looked up. His face changed before he could stop it. Kellen walked down the ramp slowly, boots ringing on the plate, each step sending a clear metallic note through the morning air. "You said safe access," he told Victor, not loud, not angry. "Stable, load-bearing, compliant." Victor climbed onto the lower landing, pressed one hand against the rail, and shifted his weight. Nothing moved. He looked at the welded seams, the bracing, the anchor heads, the smooth ground edges, the clear threshold transition at the porch. Kellen showed him a short phone video of the loaded utility cart rolling the full length of the ramp, along with a close-up of the torque-marked anchor bolts. He crouched once, checked the bolt plates, then stood with his mouth set in a hard line. The paper had nowhere left to hide. Kellen handed him the same denial notice, now clipped to a flat piece of cardboard so it would not bend in the wind. Beside the red code 402B, someone had written in black marker, "Load tested at 800 pounds, steel anchored to rock." Victor read it, then looked toward the truck driver, who was already lowering the rear lift with visible relief. The new power chair descended from the truck wrapped in clear plastic, black tires clean, control arm folded neatly at the side. Harlan watched from the porch, one hand gripping the doorframe, his face still guarded because hope can feel dangerous when it has been denied too many times. Victor signed the release form with small, stiff movements, then took hold of the chair's rear handle as the driver removed the plastic. For a moment, the only sound was the lift gate settling and the soft tick of cooling motorcycle engines. Then Victor began guiding the power chair up the ramp. He moved slowly at first, expecting a tremor, a slip, a flaw he could name. The diamond plate answered with traction. The frame answered with silence. Halfway up, he stopped and looked at the steel beneath him, and every rider on that hill watched him understand what 2 days of work had done to one line of red ink. Kellen stood aside at the porch, giving Victor the full path, giving Harlan the full dignity of seeing the rule obeyed so completely it could no longer be used against him. When the chair reached the top landing, Victor turned it carefully toward the doorway and set the brake. "Delivery complete," he said, and the words came out smaller than the clipboard in his hand. Harlan did not reach for the chair right away. He looked at the ramp first, at the wet steel, at the handrails, at the old broken pines stacked by the cabin wall, and then at Kellen's blackened hands resting quietly at his sides. No one cheered. They did not need to. The hill had spoken in steel. Harlan rolled closer to the new power chair, as if it might vanish if he trusted it too quickly. The control arm was smooth under his fingers, the seat firm, the tires still smelling faintly of new rubber and factory plastic, and for a long second, he only sat beside it in his old manual wheelchair, looking from the machine to the ramp and back again. Kellen did not rush him. None of the riders did. They stood in a loose line along the porch and lower drive, grown men with tired shoulders, mud on their boots, and soot worked deep into the creases of their hands, giving the old man the one thing no form had given him all weekend: time. Finally, Harlan transferred into the power chair with careful movements, jaw tight, refusing help until the last inch, when Kellen steadied the chair by one rail without making it look like charity. The brake clicked. The motor hummed. Harlan placed his thumb on the control and eased forward. The front wheels crossed the porch threshold without catching, rolled onto the 1/4-inch diamond plate, and gripped the raised pattern cleanly despite the damp morning air. The chair moved down the ramp at a slow, steady pace, past the first rail joint, past the switchback pad, past the anchor heads set into the stone like dark metal promises. Nothing shifted. Nothing complained. The hill held him. At the lower landing, Harlan stopped and looked back up toward his cabin, seeing it from a place he had not reached by himself in months. The porch no longer looked like the edge of a trap. It looked like home again. Victor stood near his sedan with the signed delivery form tucked under his arm, quiet now, smaller somehow, not humiliated in a loud way, but corrected by something more permanent than an argument. Before leaving, he glanced once at the red code 402B notice, now folded on the porch table beside a spare 5/8-inch wedge anchor dusted with pale rock powder. He had brought a refusal. The hill gave back a receipt. Harlan drove the chair back up, slow at first, then steadier as he felt the traction beneath him and the rail beside him. When he reached Kellen, his eyes were wet, but his voice stayed rough and proud. "You built me a way back." Kellen looked away toward the steel ramp, as if accepting thanks directly might burn worse than slag. "No," he said. "We just made sure the door worked the way it should have." The riders began packing tools without ceremony, coiling welding leads, lifting clamps, shutting down the generator until the hillside finally lost its mechanical growl and returned to wind, damp leaves, and cooling steel. One by one, the Harley started, not roaring in victory, but rumbling low and steady, the sound of men leaving after doing what they came to do. Harlan watched them roll down the road, Kellen last, his creaking leather vest dark against the morning light, his massive shadow passing once across the ramp before the bike turned toward the pines. That afternoon, Harlan drove the new chair down to the lower landing and back up 3 times, not because he needed to, but because he could. Some kindness arrives soft, with flowers and careful words. Some arrives covered in rust dust, smelling of ozone, carrying steel tubing and a torque wrench, and it does not ask a broken man to feel grateful before it gives him back his path. The lesson was not that rules do not matter. The lesson was that rules should protect people, not bury them under paper. On that rocky hillside, A denied delivery became a permanent road home, and the old medic learned that dignity can be welded, bolted, tested, and left behind for someone else to use every single day. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.